Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series of episodes is Dr. Stella Tikachova, a project manager in the European space industry. She's previously been a project manager for Thales Alenia Space and has managed long-term research projects for the European Commission. She is the author of Emerging Space Markets, published by Springer. She's currently at work on another book and has hosted a Springer Nature video seminar called The Emerging Lunar Economy. Springer Nature is the sponsor of this series. As you can tell from Dr. Tikachova's bio, we'll be talking about space, particularly the fact that it's no longer a Cold War-style race between the US and Russia to be the first to reach some interplanetary milestone. The space market has gone decidedly commercial, as if Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson haven't made that obvious already. Even so, commercial space travel is only the tip of the Martian iceberg. More than simply a checkmark on a billionaire's bucket list, the rapidly growing space market has shifted from government agencies to the private sector, with the two now collaborating on developing a diverse economy around habitation and research, lunar construction, satellite manufacturing and servicing, launch services, and who exactly is going to be cleaning up the clouds of space debris floating around up there. And as you can imagine, all of this has had quite an impact on the research and institutional landscape that feeds into the space market. In this final episode of the series, we discuss near-term goals for the space market, the growing problem with space debris, and how educational needs and trends are evolving for those interested in space exploration and research. So looking ahead, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what some of the, you've mentioned a couple, but what are some of the major near-term milestones we're expected to reach, say, in the next 15 to 20 years?
Well, I think we will see more and more geostationary satellites being serviced. On the next 15 years, probably every third geostationary satellite will be serviced, refueled, and repaired, and so on. It will change completely the way satellites will be produced and manufactured. So the space manufacturing industry will be completely changed, because I believe that in the next 5 years, 10 years, we'll be producing satellites which will have the capabilities to be repaired in orbit. And not only repaired, but also deorbited, serviced, or some of them would even have modular interfaces and so on.
Okay.
So I think that will completely change the way satellites will be and payloads will be manufactured. It is very possible that more and more companies would push the satellite manufacturers to have exchangeable parts of the satellite in orbit. Also, what we might see in the future is having satellite manufacturing in low Earth orbit. We might have depots with fuel in geostationary orbit to refuel the satellites. I believe the biggest future, as I mentioned, will be on-orbit satellite servicing, because it will be very clear that launching more and more satellites will create space debris, which might lead that human spaceflight might become almost impossible in less than 10 years, as it would cause threat for the astronauts on board the space station or future commercial space stations. So then we will also see one or two commercial space stations suborbital industry will take up, but also we would see solar power satellites, and we will see the use of CubeSats for lunar interplanetary exploration, and so on. So I think it will be a different industry, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to say, you've brought up space debris several times now, and I imagine with all the activity in these markets, it's become a major issue, essentially creating its own business opportunity, as you've kind of pointed at. Can you talk a little bit about what space debris is and the threats it poses and what will need to be done?
Well, it's actually small parts of satellites or parts of satellites and rockets orbiting, being in the low Earth orbit,
Mm.
for example. At the moment, by let's say in 2020, there were 2,300 operational satellites, and there were more than 34,000, 35,000 space debris objects larger than 10 centimeters, and 900,000 pieces of 1 centimeter to 10 centimeter debris orbiting. So imagine how polluted our orbits are. And at the same time, we have companies like Starlink, Amazon. Starlink is going to launch, I think, more than 42,000 satellites, Amazon 3,000. So there is a huge threat of space debris collusion. And once there is a collusion, there will be a much bigger pollution due to the Kepler syndrome. So satellite operators are facing extremely complex environment as satellite owners, particularly the operators with their aging satellites in geostationary orbit. And then you have the mega constellation in low Earth orbit and other orbits completely polluting. So it's an issue which it's becoming uncontrollable.
Mm-hmm. And what does this mean for other sectors of the market? In terms of traveling back and forth.
Well, that means that basically, if you cannot clean the orbit, you will not be able to have a human spaceflight.
Mm-hmm.
So the companies like, for example, Astroscale, who is proposing, and other companies which are proposing active space debris removal services
Mm-hmm.
to remove aging satellites. There are other companies which are looking, and ESA is funding also. They have a clean space initiative where they're funding initiatives for removing, let's say, rocket parts and so on. From it's extremely complex environment. So what it means is that it's very possible that the orbits are so polluted that neither commercial space station, you would not be able to launch astronauts, cosmonauts in low Earth orbit because they will be exposed on a daily basis of the threat of space debris.
Yep.
And also, there is something else, not only the human part, but the commercial loss. For example, Eutelsat, they lost a satellite which they think was potentially lost by the Intelsat 29E was lost a few years ago, and they lost 40 to 50 million of revenues per year due to the loss of the satellite. So imagine the financial losses from space debris. Mm-hmm. This is just one example.
Yep. You mentioned the loss of a satellite, and what are some other stories or events that have occurred as a result of space debris? I mean, I think last time we talked, you talked about how complicated the maneuvering and the navigating around space debris has become, and the number of flight adjustments, that vehicles need to make in order to pass through the debris without hitting it.
Exactly. Well, it's extremely complex, and the space station, if a few years ago I had to do, let's say, 1 or 2 maneuvers per year, now it has to make many more maneuvers.
Mm-hmm.
And space debris has actually increased. Actually, you probably heard from the Chinese. There was in 2007, they tested their anti-satellite weapon and destroyed one of their own satellites, non-operational, and it created 2,300 pieces of traceable debris. Can you imagine? At least. So there was also another. There are a lot of issues, and particularly with the uncontrolled reentry of rocket and spacecraft bodies, with 40, which are almost some of them surviving the entry of the Earth atmosphere. So it's very expensive also to do space station maneuvering. And another story which you probably heard was, and I think that was the one we discussed, was the Starlink satellite being almost in danger with the ADM Iolos, the European, the ESA mission ADM Iolos. They were going to crash almost until ESA didn't move their own mission. So this is a very good example of how the lack of space traffic surfaces can actually cause a huge loss on both sides. Because in 2019, SpaceX apparently didn't receive the warning from the European Space Agency that they need to move their Starlink satellite from the trajectory of the IDM Iolo satellite, and they didn't take any action. But it's not. The issue is that are no space traffic services at the moment on a global level who can actually issue warnings to both commercial and space agencies and so on. And this is something which is being considered at the moment, how to create. And Europe is looking at this.
Okay, excellent. I'm very curious, with all of the changes and disruption and new technology and new opportunities that are being developed in the space market in general, how is this being supported or reflected in research happening in higher educational institutions? What new research opportunities have opened up? How is that changing sort of the higher educational approach to this market? I'm thinking it's not just tech or scientifically orientated. I think perhaps you'd have this creeping into economics, law, all kinds of other areas and disciplines in higher education.
Well, actually, in the domain of, I'm talking for Europe, okay, because
Sure.
this is, in Europe, the European Commission is actively encouraging research in this domain. And recently was published the European Horizon Call, which is exactly encouraging innovation, technology innovation, but for new space companies, European ones. And they're directly targeting researchers from all over Europe, not only researchers working for companies, but exactly university, research institutes, encouraging this diversity, which is a very nice, let's say, a very good trend taking place, because in Europe they realize that a lot of the ideas and comes from the research community and the scientists. And there are a lot of universities, and like the International Space University at TU Delft, the aerospace faculty, which encourage the creation of new ideas and concepts, where they actually bring together not only the researchers, but also the company. So they create technology spin-offs, they reach the end user. So it's extremely important. But the education, and there are lots of prizes, the Galileo prizes, the Copernicus prizes. There are a lot of research networks happening in Europe, but they're mainly these research networks. They're funded by the European Commission.
Okay.
So this is the big difference. They're funded by the European Commission, who is actually encouraging to get these innovative ideas to create this melting pot of new ideas and research.
Okay. And do you see any funding also coming from the private sector too? Partnerships between private and educational institutions?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that would be pretty much this type of research networks,
Yeah.
let's say, in Europe, where you have this, let's say, golden opportunity. Yes, I do see, but the situation in Europe is a bit different. So that's why in Europe we have the new Space Cassini Fund, which was created to fund European startups and SMEs. And also in Europe, there are much more difficulties in getting funding. So if a researcher wants to get funding, he needs to get the end user, the industry end user needs well reflected.
Mm. How do you see, related to that previous question, how do institutions or even libraries support those research needs? I mean, what are you seeing happening within institutions that are educational institutions that are helping to support researchers in their efforts?
Well, I think libraries have a very, very important role of actually promoting the new research ideas, on being also, let's say, the interface, the facilitator of putting the multidisciplinary knowledge in one place. And particularly, it might be very beneficial to have like webinars being created, lectures by these libraries where they put knowledge from different places in one place.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that these libraries, I'll give you an example with the Springer webinar I had. It was not only people from ESA, but also from the library from ESA, but from the European Commission, from other areas, who expressed very strong interest. And because of this webinar, I got contacted by a lot of universities in Europe to provide input for their master theses. So in Europe at the moment, also in Luxembourg, there are initiatives like master studies for in-situ resource utilization for space-related topics. And there is more and more growing business also from the business students to study related topics, and space legal and lawyers. So for them, libraries can provide this knowledge.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Stella, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure speaking.
You just heard from Dr. Stella Tikachova, an author and project manager in the European space industry. Springer Nature is the sponsor of this series. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.